Welcome to the College of Education and Human Ecology's webinar on educational leadership, the first in a series of 3 webinars being hosted by our college this winter. I am Noelle Arnold, Senior Associate Dean of the college. School leadership is a complex role, and the college has historically partnered with thought leaders, practitioners, and school administrators to address the critical issues of the day. In recent years, the Superintendents in Residence program has offered a unique opportunity for the college to engage more deeply and meaningfully with educational leaders and others in the community. The college has organized well-attended opportunities for the exchange of important ideas to advance innovation and collaboration. This year, the Superintendents in Residence have created this series of 3 virtual panel discussions for K-12 leaders and other practitioners in the educational space. In today's webinar, we will focus on educational equity and access, how this guides the decisions that school leaders make to ensure that all students receive access to a high-quality education and have opportunities to succeed. Today's webinar will be moderated by Dr. Talisa Dixon. Dr. Dixon is Superintendent and Chief Executive Officer of Columbus City Schools, Ohio's largest school district. She is also one of 3 superintendents in residence at the College of Education and Human Ecology, a fellowship program bringing Ohio superintendents from urban, rural, and suburban school districts to share knowledge with the college, develop active research agendas, and share learning that benefits school communities.
Thank you, Noelle. I would like to welcome our esteemed panelists for today. Joining our discussions are 3 outstanding educational leaders, all of whom focus on equity and access as part of their work. Dr. Donna Ford is a distinguished professor in the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University. In addition, she is also a faculty affiliate with the Curran Institute and the Center for Latin American Studies, and a professor in the Department of Educational Studies Special Education Program. She conducts research primarily in gifted education and culturally responsive multicultural urban education. Dr. Dionne Blue is the Chief Equity Officer for Columbus City Schools, where she is responsible for creating and implementing a comprehensive and collaborative vision for diversity, equity, and inclusion for the largest school district in Ohio. On a mission to create equitable outcomes for all students, she is focused on improving student access and opportunities and addressing the systemic barriers that produce disproportionate student outcomes. Dr. Bernice Hamilton is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Dublin City Schools. There, she coordinated professional development opportunities for school staff and administration and led the district's justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. I'm excited about this opportunity, for as the superintendent of Columbus City Schools, I have made equity a priority. And it just didn't start with Columbus. I bring to this work, we started in 2016 with my former district. We were the first district in Cuyahoga County to adopt an educational equity policy. I understand the importance of this work, and that's why I believe that every district should have an equity focus and have someone designated to lead this work and this discussion on behalf of the students that we serve. So today's webinar will begin with a panel discussion that we would take, then we would take questions from the audience. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A at any time. We will do our best to answer as many as possible. We'll start the discussion by describing what is meant by educational equity. We hear this term applied to various schools and often work contexts, but let's clarify exactly what does that mean and how we're defining it. So we will begin with Dr. Ford.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join our panel discussion. It's very important and timely. I want to begin by saying that COVID has definitely reminded us and reinforced for some, and it may be new for some, of how inequitable, unjust, unfair, I'm just going to stick with education, our educational system is, especially for any student who lives in poverty and any student who is minoritized. And I'm specifically talking about Black and Hispanic students. I also want to say that we are living in 3 pandemics. So let's not lose sight of 2 others. So we have COVID. We have the racist pandemic that has existed centuries before COVID. And we also have the economic pandemic. So people who are low income and minoritized, we are getting triple beat up, for lack of a better word, okay? So I want to start with what equity is not. Equity is not equality. Equality is giving individuals the same thing, even though they have something different, and that includes curriculum. Equity is doing something different, teaching in a different way, assessing in a different way, creating the learning environment in a different way, thinking about, the food that students will eat at school, and more, where we're going to have family teacher conferences and more. So it's not doing the same, it is doing something different. And it's being unapologetic about addressing those differences. Equity is not just a 6-letter word. Equity is student-centered, it is culturally centered, it is culturally responsive. Here's what equity is not. Equity is not colorblind. Equity is not culture blind. Equity is not culturally assaultive. It's a commitment to make differences. So as Dr. Dixon said, our superintendent for Columbus, I work in gifted education, and you can almost not get any more unjust, racist, and classist and elitist within the field of gifted and talented education. It is a battle to desegregate and integrate gifted education and advanced placement classes. So I want to end by saying you can not only just have a philosophy of equity, you have to show in your behavior that you're equity oriented. And then I got to put a plug in here. You can quantify equity. So in gifted education, for example, if Black students are 40% of your school district, then they should be at minimum 32% of your gifted program. And you can quantify that with discipline, which is unjust, as well as special education. All 3, I'm gonna stop right here. Lack of access to gifted, too much access to special education, which is not very special, and then too much policing of our Black and brown bodies, so that we are over disciplined, suspended, and expelled at unjust, inequitable ways. So this is time for a change, and it's long overdue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ford. Let's now go to Dr. Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton, how do you define educational equity?
Thank you, Dr. Dixon, and thank you also, Dr. Ford. Educational equity, if we look at the term, and I like to break things down into their simplest forms. Equity just means giving people what they need in order to be successful. And as Dr. Ford said, there are many ways in which it does not show up, but equity is including things like students who are on IEPs are given educational equity. But if it applies to my child, it's something that I think my child deserves. But if it doesn't, I don't look at it as being one of those pieces of the equitability puzzle. Equity is also having coaches or having sports and so many other things. But Dr. Ford, I believe, summed it up really well. Equity is giving people what they need in order to be successful, whether it's an IEP, whether it's a coach, whether it's additional training, additional time on exams and things like that. But it's often something that's overlooked, especially when it comes to our students who are put in special ed or who are in marginalized spaces. So thanks, Dr. Ford.
Okay, and we will close out this particular question with you, Dr. Blue, on how do you define educational equity?
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. So I too want to build on what Dr. Ford said. A couple of things resonated, and then I also just kind of want to build onto that. So one of the pieces that I wanted to just kind of flesh out a little bit has to do with opportunity. So opportunities can be available, but if our students aren't prepared for those opportunities, then those opportunities are not meaningful. So we have to also be intentional on how we scaffold in order to help students to reach the goal, high expectations that we set for them that may be set for other students. So it's access, but it's also bridging whatever that gap is so that students will be able to take advantage of whatever those opportunities are. But the piece I want to kind of build from there has to do with also looking at equity from a systemic level. So we can address equity from like the student base. So making sure that students have what they need, but what are the systems that have been created that we may have created or that we may have inherited that keep these sorts of things in existence, and they keep happening because the system itself has to be addressed. So at the same time that we're addressing inequities at the student level, we also have to address them at the systemic level, and so that we can remove barriers so that we're not always just addressing the symptoms, and we're able to really make the transformational changes that Dr. Ford mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. So when we talk about educational equity, we are talking about those policies, those practices, those programs, personnel, resources that are required to ensure, as you stated, that equitable educational opportunities are provided for all of our students. And if we don't tackle it there, right, then it won't happen. And we do not want this very important work to be a phase, something that is, that's the buzzword right now. And that's not what it's about. We have to get to do some root cause analysis and really have those tough, brutal conversations, the work that the three of you are leading and that you're so committed to doing. And that's why I appreciate that we're having this conversation today. So let's continue when we're talking about, let's talk about what do we need from higher education in order to prepare our educators to be the type of equity-centered advocates and change agents, because this work is not easy. And it really, as I stated, facilitates, it calls for some very difficult conversations. And many times, I think for our K-12 leaders, we need those partnerships from higher ed. I call it those safety nets, right? So you need that in order for them to have partners to help facilitate these conversations. So we'll go back to you, Dr. Ford. We say Donna, we're using first names. How do you believe, what do we, or let's start with Bernice and Dionne. What do you need from your higher ed partners in order to facilitate this work in your districts?
So I'll begin. Thank you, Dr. Dixon. I just had this conversation the other day about the huge chasm that exists between higher ed and also our K-12 teachers. And there are a number of things that are missing. One is that often our higher ed institutions will have pre-service teachers participate in something that looks like an urban cohort. And an urban cohort is often an opportunity for those pre-service teachers to go into an urban setting and teach students in that urban setting. And they do that for maybe 10 weeks or maybe just a couple of weeks. And then they go back into the classroom with very little else being done. But then those same teachers say, oh, wow, that's what the urban cohort looks like. So I'm going to go back into my safety net and teach in teach where I grew up in a community that is very homogeneous, but has very little diversity, very little equity, very little inclusion, and very little support for those things. So I think that's one piece that's missing, that we don't give pre-service teachers, we don't give them the truth about what they can expect and send them back into their comfort zones. The other thing is that in higher ed, we don't work with our K-12 school systems to say, you know, we have CRT or critical race theory in our at our graduate level, and we want to teach you what it is and what it is not, and give you the opportunity or give you the script so you can say, we are not teaching critical race theory in K-12 school systems, but we send teachers out there and they have to deal with disgruntled parents, a disgruntled community around what is and what is not critical race theory. So I think as folks who work in higher ed can do a better job of working with teachers who are already in school systems to teach them what critical race theory is and what it is not, and the fact that they don't teach it. But again, we just send people out and say, okay, you are certified, you go teach. But it's up to folks in higher ed to help to bridge that divide between pre-service teachers and then those who are back out there in the school systems, because that's definitely missing.
I agree with that 100%, Dr. Hamilton. And I would say also, there are things that may be, and I'll just, kind of speak for us, Columbus City, but there are specific initiatives that we're working on. It would be nice to have, if we have pre-service teachers, to allow them to be more involved in some of the PD that we give to our in-service teachers, because these are the initiatives, these are the expectations for when you come into the district. This is what you'll have to know. So to be taught one thing in your higher ed classroom, but then get to your in-service, now this is your classroom, and it doesn't necessarily align with maybe what you've learned. That's a disconnect, and that is a disservice to a first-year teacher also. So I think the way that we embed them into the culture of the building during that time would be helpful for them. I also think that, maybe even how, from the K-12 side, how we decide where pre-service teachers will be assigned to whom. We want to make sure that they're assigned to our best and brightest so that they can get some of those extra tips and that extra mentoring, and then kind of what they're allowed to do in that classroom so that they can start to really get more comfortable. There's, I think, also aspects of building relationships and understanding student behavior, things that we know now about neuroeducation that may be different than, when we were all kind of in school. I think kind of diversifying some of the things that they learn could also be helpful, because students are very complex, the things that they're going through. Just kind of back to that idea Dr. Ford talked about in terms of these kind of multiple pandemics. These are things that teachers may come in not really understanding or thinking about, because they're not a part of a traditional education experience. So I think both higher ed and K-12 could probably stand to look at some of the ways that we work together to be more intentional about what do our students need and what do we need from you. And then there's also a piece that is not necessarily about pre-service, but about how we're getting students into the field of education. So even in terms of who these students are, where they come from, what they know, what they're interested in, and we need more diversity in that aspect as well, so that when teachers come out, we are creating what we need instead of trying to retrofit and train into them what we need.
So it sounds like that we really need the opportunity to co-design something with our higher ed partners that's very specific to our districts, one, the communities, two, that we serve, but so that students really get an equitable opportunity. There's that one book we all know of, how can you teach me if you don't know me, right? So how do we best partner so that when people are coming to this work, understand this community of diverse learners that they're going to be interacting with and become those change agents. So thank you, Bernice and Dionne. That was, I love that. So then Dr. Ford, Donna, when you hear this, right, what our K-12 leaders, what we need, what's your response from higher ed of what you can do more of to co-design something specific for our districts?
And I appreciate what was just said by both of you, as well as the ordering of the question. Let's hear from our P to 12 colleagues. All right. So I want to make a few points. One, and I want to be quoted correctly. Critical race theory is not used in the P to 12 setting. Teachers are not doing that. However, I don't have a problem if they do. And especially with our middle school and high school students. So we need to take that on. And but I know that's highly, that's a hot mess right now. But I'm saying, yeah, it should be. We do need to teach all of our students to be anti-racist and culturally responsive. I just think about some of the events of racism that have increased by students in P to 12 settings over the past few years, and it's appalling. I follow the FBI hate crimes, and I look every year when they update it, and schools and universities are always in the top 3 places for hate crimes. So there's a lot of education through a cultural lens, an anti-racist lens, an unapologetic lens, and an equity lens that needs to be tapped. To those of us in higher education and P to 12, let's stop just talking about implicit bias. We need to have conversations about explicit bias. For example, the teacher who, so a little 5-year-old Black boy a few months ago used the bathroom and clogged up the commode, and the teacher made him dig out and unclog that commode with his bare hands. First of all, he shouldn't have been done it anyway. He's not the damn janitor. Now I'm getting worked up. He's not the janitor, or whatever term you want to use. And he should not have had to do that. You are not going to tell me that that was implicit bias. That was explicit bias and more. All right. So let's also talk about explicit bias. I think that definitely our courses need to have an anti-racist, culturally responsive focus. The courses, all of the courses, I don't care what you're teaching, all of the courses need to have an anti-racist, culturally responsive focus. I think that we need to have degree programs and endorsements and certification in, I'm just gonna call it anti-racist, culturally responsive education. And for the record, I'm teaching a class called Anti-Racist, Culturally Responsive Education here at OSU, and I have one by a similar title for those of in Columbus schools taking the endorsement. Thank you for that collaboration. Okay, so we need this in every class. We need programs, and we need licensure and endorsement, for example. I appreciate the comment about field placement. We need to give our students a dose of our pre-service teachers, a dose of the real world. What we're currently doing too often in higher education is teaching our educators from classrooms that do not exist. Let me say it again. Preparing our educators for classrooms that do not exist. Then they burn out. They fizzle out quickly, and our students are working with substitutes, which contributes to the achievement gap. That's another issue. We need to, just a couple more points, we need more minoritized faculty. By the way, and of course, educators in the P to 12 setting, but also as university faculty, and we need to be representative. So representation matters. I don't mean we're going to be window dressing, because when we are in the field, we do some hard work. It's called the black tax or the cultural tax, and I would rather pay that tax than the tax to the feds. All right, I gladly pay the cultural and the black tax. Last, I want to say, and this is an unshameful, I'm not ashamed. This is a plug for Dean Don Pope Davis. We probably wouldn't be having this talk without him, all right? But my dean, our dean, has been clear in word and deed that we are going to have that diverse faculty, and that we are going to prepare our children. So our pillars, our goal statements, our mission, the hiring, it needs to be replicated all over the United States and the world, effecting change.
Wow, thank you. And that's what we talked about earlier. Our DEI leaders have to be bold, right? Our districts have to set bold, very intentional and strategic goals. So there were a couple of questions that came from the chat, and one was, what do our DEI leaders need, right? We're seeing now, for us in Columbus City Schools, that was part of when I arrived in 2019. I knew I wanted a chief of equity because I did this work prior in a former district. But now we're seeing that so many districts now are hiring DEI leaders. So I think it's important too that you get what you need. And that was one of the questions in the chat. What is it that DEI leaders need from higher ed so that they are supported, right? So what are your professional development needs as we talk about this conversation and you lead this in your districts?
I'll talk about not necessarily just what we need from higher ed, but just what we need in general. And I'm sure Dr. Hamilton can echo this also, but at the end of the day, I think that what is happening now in our country is that having a DEI professional in your district it's a very new thing, but it's also sort of trendy. It's easy to implement, but it's difficult when you realize what it's going to take to get to really accomplish what this person will need to accomplish. So we have a diversity director, we have a chief equity officer, we have this person, and that's sort of the end of the end. Check, we're done, we're good. And if there's a problem, we call them. But there's so much more to creating equity within our P12 spaces that I think sometimes when people realize what's really needed, it's more than they may be at that moment willing to do. So when it comes to what is needed, support from the highest levels is what is needed. I couldn't do the work that I do if I didn't have the support of my superintendent, of my board. If that weren't the case, I mean, it's an uphill battle. So that's the first level of support. Resources are also needed, and the understanding that it's going to be a slow process, because equity, we didn't become a place of inequity overnight. And so the results of what we have to accomplish is also not going to be overnight. But I also think that, kind of within the leadership of the district, we have to realize that equity is all of our jobs. We are all chief equity officers because equity has to be centered in all of our work in order to really have the ripple effect that we need it to have. I'll stop there and we can come back and, do some more later, but I'll let you go ahead from here.
Yeah, I definitely concur. And I think we all should, like you said, take on the responsibility of being focused extensively on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And, I want to say, and from a higher education perspective, again, that means that, leadership has to recruit and retain people in those roles. All right. And when they do, they need to really interrogate the individuals to see what qualifications they have, to see if they are as we use this term already, bold, unapologetic, and angry. It's okay to be angry about injustices. If you're not angry, I just want to know what's wrong with you. All right. So yeah, angry Black scholar, right? Go ahead and claim it. And anger can fuel change. It doesn't always have to fuel violence. But I want, I want our equity, diversity, and inclusion leaders to really have the support of administration. Okay, so from the superintendent, from the school board, right, from the dean, from the board in higher education and more, so they can truly do this work. I said this a little bit earlier. We're not talking about putting somebody in place for window dressing, somebody who's just going to recycle what's been done, although we have this name. We need to put somebody in place who is experienced and who is willing to challenge the status quo for the sake of those who are marginalized.
Yeah, great. So there are some more good questions that are coming in the chat. I want to get to them real quickly. One question is like, if 80% of our teachers are predominantly white and not diverse, yet their students are, how do we support current teachers to understand and build equity and access? And then maybe we could start with you, Bernice, if you want to start.
Sure, and thank you to my esteemed colleagues for their responses to the last question. So mic drop. I think what has to happen is so often white people are given a pass when it comes to diversity. And when I say that, I'm saying they don't see themselves as being included in the diversity puzzle. Diversity just means different. It doesn't mean different only if you're from a marginalized community in one way or another. So I like to start by getting white teachers, white administrators, white central office staff to understand that diversity includes them too. And then you dig a little deeper to understand the many ways that they are diverse other than just their whiteness. But then we talk about, sorry, Dr. Ford, bias and implicit bias and all of those things and how those come into play based upon how we show up. So I think that's very important. Just getting our white colleagues to understand that you're a part of this as well. You are diverse. You're not free from being a part of this whole puzzle that we call diversity.
Thank you. And unless someone else want to chime to that, there's another question that I think kind of marries that. And the question is that if you're not in a position of power, people don't believe that they can join the coalition, right? To kind of plan and enact engagement where they believe real power exists, right? So, what do you, let's talk about that for a moment. I mean, I can talk about my journey to equity was facilitated by a former school district who the community believed this was something I needed to address when I entered, right? So for me, it was that we're just not going to address equity and window dressing, as Dr. Ford stated, but if we really wanted systemic change, that it had to be a board equity policy. And so we have to not only have it be policy driven, but we have to have some benchmarks where the board is requesting data, quarterly data, monthly data, to actually inspect those, those outcomes that were presented in the policy. So we were very strategic about that. But people, and I agree with this question is, people want to join the movement, but people believe that it has to be driven by a board or superintendent. From your level, what are your thoughts about that? Where's the drivers to this work, and will it truly happen if it doesn't start from the top?
Oh, I'd like to jump in and say something and still build upon the previous question, and that is, to be blunt, minoritized people, whether we like it or not, we are forced to be able to be bicultural and to work with the status quo, to work with whites. And if we can learn how to work with whites, you can damn sure learn how to work with us, right? So no excuses. Let's stop putting these excuses in place. So for example, so when I work, whether it is in classes or professional development, we're going to have conversations. I'm going to introduce you to models of prejudice, Gordon Outport, all right, Robert Merton. We're going to look at microaggressions, and you don't have to share it with me, but you're going to be reflective about whether you've committed any microaggressions. For example, I still reel from when I was in a private school program, and I would have the high, anyway, in a private school on scholarship, ABC, a better chance. And when I would do well, especially higher than the white privileged girls in the school, the teachers would be like, who helped you? And one of my favorites now is the teacher asked me, did you use Cliff Notes? And I'm like, who the hell is Cliff? And yeah, I cursed back then. I don't know nobody named Cliff. And so I got, she gave me a 0, thought I was being sarcastic. We didn't have Cliff Notes in my neighborhood, but we need to look at degrees of prejudice. And that means looking at old-fashioned prejudice and the more contemporary types of prejudice. So Outport's model. We need to look at Merton's model to see if there's a consistency between prejudice, how you think, and discrimination, how you act. I think there are teachers who are educators in both settings who are not necessarily prejudiced, but they won't speak up. So that means you're complicit. And then we have those who are prejudiced and do speak up. And that's why we need like a superintendent like you, Dixon, and my dean, Pope Davis, and more, holding people accountable. Let me just say a few more things. We need to unpack white privilege with this predominantly white education force, higher education, and Peter 12. We need to not just unpack white privilege, we need to have you understand white racial identity, so you can see where you are in the stages or phases of white racial identity. And this needs to be done in a proactive way, not a reactive way. And there's more, but I'm saying for educators to change, for people to change, it requires looking in the mirror. And you may not like what you see, but if you don't, we're going to help you to see yourself in a different way. So you also, I always keep saying last point, but this really is the last point. But also, you have to not just wait for the superintendent, for the dean, for the head of equity, diversity, and inclusion to tell you you need training to be culturally responsive and anti-racist. Hell, you ought to know that. And there's a quote by someone who says, diversity will manage you if you don't understand how to be culturally responsive. And you are having cultural shock with minoritized populations because you've been Pollyannic and you lived, in the suburbs, and you've made sure that your children went to private school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to avoid being around us. And you have missed out because we have a lot to offer.
Wow. Thank you. And my statement to this, last word about this is, look at the data. Go to your curriculum leaders and just ask them to pull some data for you and say, how well are our students performing across the district? Look at discipline data, performance data, resource data, because those data points could raise questions in your mind, and then you have something to speak to. So you're not just speaking in generalities, you're speaking specific to what's happening in your school district because you're looking at the data. And then once you have that data and you have that conversation, you will hope that no one turns the blind eye to what is the reality, but use that data I believe, using that data to facilitate those conversations.
Dr. Dixon, can I jump in, please?
Yes.
Because you seem like you're going to transition, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be rude. No. All right. But when we talk about, look at the data, I almost lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, it was about looking at the data and I got distracted. I'll come back. Oh, okay, here it is. I'm showing my age. I just turned 60 last month, okay? All right, so when we talk about look at the data and look at policies and procedures, let me be real clear. In the field of gifted education, the number one reason, whether we are Dr. Ford's child, my son's birthday is today, 42. So we're talking about my grandson who is 10. We're talking about me living in East Cleveland and Cleveland, Ohio on welfare and single mom versus now being, this distinguished professor who's, doing much better economically. What I want to say is no matter what, and read my face because it makes me angry and disappointed, no matter who we are, this predominantly white female teaching force is not referring us to gifted education. Whether my name is Donna, Maria, Shaniqua, it does not matter. We are not being referred, whether we live in a two-family parent income household or well off or educated. I mean, I can't say it enough. We are not referred. Teachers, educators, administrators, not you, Dr. Dixon, hide behind the test. Oh, they're doing low on tests. Well, first of all, the test is racist. Let's start with that. Okay, the reason we have low test scores, et cetera, but let me just go back to the educators. You're not referring us. You are looking at us through a lens of racism, through a lens of low expectations, to a lens of bias. So not if, but since the number one barrier to accessing gifted education and advanced placement is lack of teacher referral, we have to say, why in the world do you keep having that as a policy? I mean, and that's not a question. I'm not being rhetorical. Why? Why don't you look at who keeps over referring our Black boys for disciplinary problems? There's a pattern. Who keeps over referring us for special education, those high incidence areas, intellectually disadvantaged, emotional and behavioral disorder, ADHD, you can go on. There are usually the same people doing this. And guess what? We keep letting them do it. That means we're complicit. We got to stand up. And that means that requires being equity minded in word and deed.
Thank you. So this has been a great conversation. When we coming to the end, and I want to allow Bernice and Dionne to have some closing remarks when we think about the equity conversation and advocacy and the change that we need, and some final comments. And we would start with you, Dr. Hamilton. What is it that we should be doing, right? If we want to leave this conversation right now, what are some next steps do you think that P12 leaders should be doing, or our higher ed learners and leaders should be doing? Next steps.
Ooh, thank you for that. I think the biggest next step is to look at our people who have been put in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether your title is Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and as Dr. Blue said, or you're the Chief Equity Officer. It's not enough to put us in place and not support us, and support looks different in different communities. But I think that's the biggest thing. That's the biggest way to start, is to find out how you can support a person in that position so that they're not in 1 minute and out the door the next. And it's about who you put in place to supervise that person, who's that person's direct report, how the superintendent views diversity, equity, and inclusion, how the board views diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of those come into play, and also knowing the ins and outs of the community that person is coming into. It's again, one thing to bring a person in, and another thing to support them once they get there. Also to close the chasm between higher ed and our P12 school systems, and as Dr. Ford would say, to look at those other gaps that are already existing within school systems, the inequities with students who are in gifted programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a lot.
Dionne?
Yes, thank you. So yes, everything that you said in the last comment, it's a lot. And this is also kind of based out of my personality, is that I really think that we have to also kind of start with what's the current state of equity. There's a lot going on. There are a lot of problems. There are a lot of people who need support, both at this, both in terms of students and the adults in our buildings. And folks are just kind of spraying and praying, like we're doing things and hoping it works, and we're not sure why it's not working, and if you'd only do this, it would work. And so I think starting where we're really, to your point, Dr. Dixon, in terms of looking at data, but really figuring out what are our needs, what are our priorities, where are our biggest, kind of problem areas, and starting to really kind of focus in on the kind of resources that we put towards some of those problems and how we support folks who need it, whether it's, the white teacher who has a classroom full of students of color who isn't sure kind of what to do, but who wants to the teacher of color who may need support, who may be the person who always has to kind of take in the behavior, the students who other people kind of don't want to deal with, all sorts of things like that. And it does come back down to the way we do our work. And so, not to call out Dr. Tyson, hey, Dr. Tyson out there, but kind of talking about that coalition piece, we need top down, we need bottom up, we need side to side. So we all have to be in this conversation together. So whether it's the board creating an equity policy, which is a direction to go, whether it's the adults actually having conversations with students. Students know what they need, they know what they want, they know what they're missing, they know what's fair. We don't talk to them, we don't ask them what they need, we just do things. So talking to students is another way. Bringing in the community, of course, when you bring in the community, there's a lot of knowledge amongst our community members, whether it's from higher ed or other aspects of the community. How do we get on the same page about what it is that we need to do, so that even though we are all kind of working on this equity piece, that we're all moving in the same direction? And sometimes we're not going to all be in agreement. We talk about preaching to the choir. Sometimes the choir is off key. We all want the same thing, but we see it differently in terms of how to do it. And sometimes that's also the conversation, so that we can be kind of on the same road together to really see some of the change. So it really depends on where you're starting, but you have to start with what's our current state? Where are we in order to know where do we need to go?
Yeah, that's great. You know what? I think we do have time. I haven't got my 5-minute warning yet, but I think we have time for one more question. I'm looking at this one question in the chat. I'm going to ask you, and I start with you, Dr. Hamilton. It says, what is the extended conversation in higher ed education and K-12 education concerning the state equity repeal resolution in Ohio, and how repealing the anti-racism solution signals concern to students of color across the state? And who wants to take that first? Okay.
I'll let Dr. Ford go.
Yes, okay.
Okay, so we had a meeting and the University Senate took a vote on our I don't know what I want to call it right now, but we're against that resolution. And so we had held a meeting, and we won, so to speak. So we have demonstrated as a university, as a college and more, that we totally disagree, which goes back to my earlier statement, when I said I don't have a problem with critical race theory being taught in a P to 12 setting. So this is time to speak up, and it's overdue for us to speak up and not be silent. Let me quickly say something about the previous question, and I hope I answered that question. But let me say something about the previous question, and that is, I know, just like I pushed back on implicit bias and talked about explicit bias, I also do some pushbacking on talking about institutional and systemic bias. Institutions and systems are made up of people. And when if we don't change the attitudes and the behaviors of people, then we won't change the system or the institution. So for everyone who is here and those who are not here, this starts with ourselves. What are you going to do or continue to do? But what are you going to do from this point on to make sure that you are part of the solution and not part of the problem? And that entails owning up to your power, owning up to your social and economic and cultural capital, and sharing it with us. Giving it up, sharing it. There's room for, everybody wins when you do that.
Yeah, wow. Thank you. Thank you. Any closing comments? I know we have some other questions in the chat. I don't know if we have time to answer one more, and maybe the one about, I think the last one came from, what advice will we give to educators, graduate students, especially those who hold intersecting identities that are interested in creating equitable learning environments for students? Dr. Blue?
Find like-minded folks, because sometimes that's what you need in terms of that support. You know what I mean? Find other folks who, whether it's there are folks on your grade level team, other folks in your school, find them, either if you can't find them in your school or in your district, the interwebs have support. So find other folks who, yes, coalitions, things that, other folks who are like you, who are interested in the same work that you do, whether it's classroom teacher based or, you have some other kind of role, but find like-minded folks who are doing similar work and get that support with those folks and exchange ideas. And you'll really find that there are lots of us out here with who are doing this work, and so to never feel like you're by yourself in this, because you're not. And just reach out to some of the resources that you have around you and say, hey, I need some help, and and kind of go from there. Dr. Hamilton, go ahead, open up, say.
I was going to expand upon that too. And thank you, Dr. Blue, and talk about the fact that not just finding those like-minded people, but going back to one of our previous questions, it has to do with, I'm kind of sorry, Dr. Ford, I'm in that moment, but it's thinking about how many movements were started by people who saw themselves not being in a position of power, whether it's racially or gender identity or something else. So find those like-minded people, and gradually you can start that movement and find that momentum and make things happen. That's the way it's done. It's not always the people who have the most to say or who hold the power, quote, in quotation marks, that get the work done. So you can all get it. You can get it done, but you have to find those people, and you have to find your people and make it happen. So,
and I want to say real quick with that, I forgot to say earlier, is that both Dr. Hamilton and I are part of Central Ohio Equity Network, and there's some other folks, maybe out in the audience or here who are also a part of that. But that's one of those places where equity leaders from around the state get together and talk through, share ideas, talk through issues, find support for each other. And so it helps both in the sense of support, but also in the sense of not feeling like you have to reinvent the wheel in your work. And so that's also at least a resource that she and I have been able to take advantage of. And so for other folks who may be out there who are doing equity work somewhere around the state, or kind of within your own scope, maybe reach out to us and we can help to support you also.
Yeah, and I think that, you do surround yourself clearly by equity oriented individuals, anti-racist, culturally responsive, and so on in that in this area. You also have to know when to remove yourself from toxic people. I'm more extroverted. I see you laughing, Dr. Hamilton. I'm an extroverted person, but I've had to force myself to be introverted. And, you know, which again, with this pandemic, it's like, this gave me an opportunity to not be around you because I didn't want to be around you anyway. Right. So, but you got to learn to be, you know, to not be around those individuals, but at the same time to call them out and to challenge them. If I hear someone say something that's racist, if you can't tell by now, I'm going to speak up. I don't care what your title is, what your position is, what your race is, whatever. I'm going to speak up, and I'm definitely going to say something if we talk about vulnerable populations like children. All of us, P to 12 and higher education, we are here for children / students. And anyone who doesn't understand that is in the wrong profession.
Thank you, Dr. Ford, Dr. Blue, Dr. Hamilton. This has been a great discussion. You have just left everyone with some points to ponder, right? When we think about this work. And to all of those that are listening, know that this is not easy work, but it is the right work. And it's going to pull and tug at you many times. It will. It's the hardest work I believe I've done as a superintendent, but it is the right work to do. It is the right conversations to have, because our students are deserving of a quality, equitable education opportunity. And it's the adults who are designing it for them on their behalf, right? So think about the students that we are serving. We're servant leaders, and we have to get this right. And we have a platform to do that. Supports, we need more supports. And I'm just happy that Ohio State University is, and the College of Education and Human Ecology under Dr. Dean Poet Davis and the team are leading this work and leading these conversations. So before we go, I'd like to mention 2 items before we leave. First, please complete a very short survey at the end of this webinar. Your feedback will help us continue providing informative webinars for our viewers. Secondly, we encourage you to register for our next 2 webinars. On January 11th, we will host our second webinar in the series, Social and Emotional Supports for Students During the Pandemic. And on January 20th, the final webinar will be held, which will focus on diversifying the teacher workforce. Please go to the link posted in the chat to register, and thank you again for joining us today.